Hey there, students. Today I'm going to talk to you about the amendments passed to the Constitution during the progressive era of U.S. history, the first few years of the 20th century. Now, as we talk about amendments and the amendment process, keep in mind that amendments are like wolves. They travel in packs. There are several packs of amendments to the Constitution. This is the third. The first being the Bill of Rights, passed around the same time as the Constitution. There were 10 of them. And then the Reconstruction Amendments, 13 through 15, passed over a 5-year period after the Civil War. And then finally the Progressive Amendments, 16 through 19, that were passed during Woodrow Wilson's presidential administration. Now, before we go into amending the Constitution, let's think about why we amend it. You know, there are people who believe in this country, for good reason, that these illustrious men here crafted a governing document based on timeless principles that will never change. JK, LOL. Now, what I just told you was more of a conservative viewpoint. The progressives are not conservative types. Progressives are all about, well, I guess progress, as they put it. And the progressives believe that the Constitution needed to be updated to change with the times. When these guys were writing the Constitution, sure, they were smart guys, but this was an era of before electricity. This was an agrarian republic, very small and rural. Whereas the United States, in the meantime, had gotten larger, had gotten urbanized, was becoming a world power. So the progressive mindset was, it's about time for the Constitution to get a makeover. And this is in order to further progressive goals. Now, if the progressives could have come up with their own preamble to these amendments, it might have read something like this. We, the progressives of the United States, in order to form a stronger central government, organize society based on scientific principles, regulate business, promote moral improvement, and secure the blessings of democracy. Doesn't that word just sound so great and happy? To ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish these amendments to the Constitution of the United States of America. And so let's keep in mind that the goals of the progressives are to create a stronger central government that would legislate based on scientific principles, moral improvement, regulation of business, and political democracy. And the amendments to the Constitution passed during the progressive era are all going to fall into one or more of these categories. The four amendments are the 16th, the federal income tax, the 17th, direct election of senators, 18th, prohibition of alcohol, and 19th, women's suffrage. First of all, let's take a look at the federal income tax. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. The federal government had tried to collect an income tax a few times, and sometimes successfully, but there were others that the Supreme Court ruled this unconstitutional. That the federal government did not have unlimited power to collect taxes on personal incomes. If the federal government wants to collect a tariff, or if the federal government wants to collect taxes from the states in proportion, that's fine, but the federal government did not have a right just to reach directly into an individual's pocket. So thanks to the 16th Amendment, we have the Internal Revenue Service that can tax us directly. Before the 16th Amendment, the situation was like this, that Congress, in order to get to individuals, would have to go through the states, and they would have to be taxed in proportion to each other. Now, the states are pretty much out of the picture, and the federal government has a direct taxation relationship with you and me. Why anybody would want that, I'm not sure, but it happened. It's part of our Constitution now. So pay up. Yeah. Okay, so now let's move on to the Senate. This cartoon here is probably something you've seen already, the bosses of the Senate. And you get the impression that the Senate is controlled by the monopolists, the moneyed interests. This is a Senate of the monopolists, by the monopolists, for the monopolists. And the people's entrance is closed. And all of these trusts are dominating. And this was the public perception, that the Senate was a bastion of oligarchy, at a time when people wanted more political democracy. The populists in the late 19th century had called for the direct election of senators, and the progressives, although these are normally middle-class types from urban areas, they want to do the same thing. They think that what our government needs is an infusion of democracy, and that will make our government better. So the 17th Amendment was passed, which says that the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, that doesn't change, elected by the people thereof. Keep in mind that before the 17th Amendment, senators were appointed by state legislatures because the framers of the Constitution wanted to create a federal government that had elements of democracy, but they did not seek to create a full-on democratic government. And that is the goal of the progressives, to make this government more democratic, which they say will make it more responsive to the people. Whether that's happened or not is up for grabs, but that was the goal. Woo! Alright, now we're talking. Alright, Cosmopolitan magazine, which today has women on it and that sort of thing. Wasn't always the case. Whoa, how'd that get there? Alright, Cosmopolitan used to be a literary magazine. What you can see here, this is where a famous muckraking article was written called The Treason of the Senate. Keep in mind that muckrakers would publish articles seeking to arouse public outcry and spur government action. So David Grand Phillips wrote The Treason of the Senate, which was published in Cosmopolitan magazine, and according to the U.S. Senate website, this was a very influential piece of writing. The Treason series placed the Senate at the center of a major drive by progressive-era reformers to weaken the influence of large corporations and other major financial interests on government policymaking. Direct popular election of senators fit perfectly with their campaign to bring government closer to the people. Now, the Senate would like you to believe, oh yeah, they're all close to the people now. Look at us. We're democratic. We're responsive. Woo! Well, I don't mean to pick on any senator in particular. Lindsey Graham is one of my senators. So when you look at FEC.gov and you look at the campaign finance disclosures, you see that only about 60% of what Senator Graham takes in is from individuals. A large percentage of that is from political action committees. And then there are some other donations. Now, what those are, I have no idea. Now, keep in mind, too, that when you look at those individual donations, they're not all from people in South Carolina. A lot of these people are from other states. I looked it up, Florida, California, places like that. So, if you think that if Senator Graham has Tom Richey on line 1 and Joe Donor from California, who maxed out with all of his friends on line 2, he's picking up Joe Donor from California, okay? Anybody that really believes that the 17th Amendment actually made the government less responsive to corporations, probably a little naive. But then again, democracy always sounds good, doesn't it? Goodbye, federalism. All right, when we take a look at what these amendments have done so far, we see that these amendments have made the federal government stronger at the expense of the states. Whereas the 16th Amendment, it makes the federal government able to reach directly into my pocket without having to go through the state. It makes it so that I can directly elect my senator, but then again, my state legislature has no control over this. So there's really nothing to make sure that the senators are responsive to the people in their states. If they really wanted to do something, they would stop senators from receiving money outside of the state that they represent. Would probably be a whole lot more effective. But keep in mind that these amendments are fundamentally altering the balance of power between the federal and the state governments. That we see a larger federal government, we see the state governments being eclipsed by these amendments, but that is the objective. Then there's the 18th Amendment. That's one of those kind of like, oops. All right, now keep in mind the progressives were all about legislating moral improvement. And so they decided that they were going to place a ban, a nationwide ban on alcoholic beverages. Now, several states had already banned alcohol, but the mentality here is like, hey, alcohol's bad. It makes people hit women and all kinds of stuff, and it would just be better if we didn't even have it, if it were legal. I mean, we all know that when the government makes something illegal that nobody uses it, right? And the 18th Amendment is the only amendment to be directly repealed by another amendment. So keep in mind, the way you can remember this is, in the United States today, if you're 18, you can't buy alcohol. If you're 21, you can. So 18th Amendment prohibits alcohol. The 21st Amendment, you can buy it. So just keep that in mind. That makes it very, very easy to remember. It's almost like they did it on purpose. And let's not forget about the ladies. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John Adams when the Constitution was being written, like, hey, remember the ladies. Over 100 years later, finally time to remember the ladies. Now, a lot of times we hear ladies first, especially in the South, where I'm from. We tend to be a little more traditional. Now, in the case of the progressive amendments, it's ladies last, because we have already had the income tax, direct election of senators, prohibition, and now it's about time to take Abigail Adams' advice and remember the ladies. Now, it's not just like the men remembered it. The ladies had to do a lot of reminding. They had campaigns. You had suffragettes. This was a women's suffrage parade that's idealized. This was in 1913 when the 16th and the 17th Amendments were passed. And the ladies are like, hey, what about us? You want to create a more democratic country, right? How about letting us vote? So the ladies are processing there. Now, what's important to remember is that, once again, federalism is at work here, that several states by this time had already allowed women to vote. And most of these states were out west. And this was a byproduct of the pioneer spirit. You had really a more self-reliant woman out here in the west, whereas in the south and even in the east, in general, women were kind of kept away from things and didn't really have to contribute the same way to survival like you would out on a homestead or something like that. So the frontier life really created a more egalitarian mindset in the West, and women's suffrage marches from west to east. At the time that this cartoon was printed, you see that the western states were the first to allow women to vote. And this is a map of women's suffrage prior to 1920, where you see that out west it was happening, whereas the further east you go, and especially here in the southeast, that you don't have a lot of suffrage. Okay, so the green, you've got full women's suffrage. All the other colors, you have some types of women's suffrage or no types. In the case of states like South Carolina, where I live, we tend to be the last unless you want to secede from the Union or something like that. So west to east, which looks really interestingly like the map of marijuana laws in the U.S. today, that you see that western states are much more likely to adopt medical marijuana, legalization of marijuana in a couple states like Colorado and Washington. So you see the same sort of west to east procession, but that's another story. And here are suffragettes marching in New York City in October of 1917. So lots of women are having to advocate for themselves, but then again, that's part of the democratic process. And finally, after the progressive era is coming to an end, after World War I's over, we had some women helping out in the armaments factories and that sort of thing. The 19th Amendment is finally passed, ladies last. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So let's review here. The progressive amendments are the 16th, the federal income tax, the 17th, direct election of senators, the 18th, prohibition of alcohol, and the 19th, women's suffrage. And these amendments together create a stronger central government, and it implements the goals of the progressives to implement a government based on scientific principles, moral improvement, the regulation of business, and political democracy. The income tax, implementing scientific principles because it makes more sense if incomes are spread out. It's very efficient to create this system where the federal government can efficiently tax, where you can tax corporations as well, so it gives the government another means to regulate business. The 17th creates more democracy, whereas the 18th Amendment implements scientific principles, at least the science of the time. Alcohol is bad, we should ban it, although also that's regulating business, regulating the alcohol trade. And finally, the 19th Amendment, which increases political democracy and also contributes to progressive goals of moral improvement, because it was thought that women will vote based on moral issues, and certainly are more likely to vote on moral issues and social issues than men. We men don't really tend to be all that compassionate when we go to the polls and vote, as a whole. So that about wraps that up. Keep in mind to subscribe to my channel, visit my website, instructional materials, all kinds of stuff, tutoring options, all kinds of stuff like that. I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Tom Richey. I got a Facebook page. Would love to interact with you. Comment on the video. Let me know. Do you have any questions? Did you like the video? Did you hate it? Like, dislike? All of that kind of stuff. So for now, I'm going to go, but I am going to be back. Until next time.